$245% is the new tariff number we're hearing about. What's the meaning of this?
That tariff rate is for electric vehicles. But, electric vehicles are not going to get into the U.S. regardless of tariff rate, because the Biden administration actually essentially prohibited them on American roads because of their capability of spying on America. So whatever the tariff rate is, 245%, 2,450%, they're just not getting in.
And so give me a picture as of today. We're following up on our short conversation last week. What's the state of play with these tariffs, and what's your best sense of what they're really all about?
Well, President Trump is negotiating with those 130 or so countries that have contacted the White House since his April 2nd Liberation Day announcement. And essentially what Trump is going to do is redirect trade flows around the world. Everybody needs the U.S. consumer market. It comprises almost 30% of global consumer spending. And so he's going to negotiate with Japan and with other countries. And this is going to really set a template. Once he gets those first deals in place, he probably will extend them to others. China, which is refusing to talk to the United States now, is probably going to be left out in the cold. And eventually it will have to come to the table. But regardless of whether China talks to us or not, Trump is resetting everything around the world right now with these tariffs.
Well, that's actually very interesting, because I've seen analyses on both ends of this. Some people are telling me, who I find quite credible, that they will come to the table. It'll maybe take a month or something like that. And there's other people who believe, for pretty credible reasons, that they're just not going to come to the table. Any thoughts here?
Well, countries are not required to trade with us. But if they don't trade with us, they're not getting access to our consumer market. So I think countries will understand that they have to do that. But, we'll see. There's a 90-day pause, and we'll see what happens at the end of that. And we'll understand one way or the other. But I think that economic reality is countries need the United States more than we need them. So this is going to be, I think, good for us and not good for China.
Well, and so specifically on China, that's actually what I was, I probably didn't say the word China. Specifically, I've heard that they may, of course, there's plenty of countries. I mean, I think there's 80 plus right now that I'm aware of that have decided to come to the table. But China itself, as you mentioned, has not been very forthcoming. And the question is, will they ever?
I suppose at some point they will. Xi Jinping is perfectly capable of taking China off the cliff. And so, yeah, he says he won't be bullied. He says he's not going to talk to us until we come begging. So I don't know. But this is not going to be a good story for China. Because remember, our economy is much bigger than theirs. Even with their inflated gross domestic product reports, their economy is less than 2/3 the size of ours. Last year, China ran an enormous merchandise trade surplus against us, $295.4 billion, which was 5.8% bigger than the merchandise trade surplus in 2023. I mean, they've got everything to lose. Now, they can retaliate as they've done with the rare earth export ban. But, they tried that against Japan in 2010. It didn't work. China collapsed in a couple months. They can tell Boeing we're not accepting deliveries of planes. But if President Trump says if he prohibits Boeing from selling planes and replacement parts, there are going to be a lot of planes in China not flying. So, we have the power. The only way China wins this trade war is if it gets Trump to preemptively surrender. Now, Trump knows he holds the high cards, but the question is, and a lot of people say, well, we're a democracy, we've got to give up. I don't think so, because Trump actually believes in these tariffs. He knows how important it is. But that's China's only route out of this.
So one of the biggest, criticisms that I hear often is that these tariffs, the cost of the increased good cost is going to be transferred to the consumer. And how do you view that?
Well, we actually have an experiment, and that was 2018 when Trump imposed 25% tariffs on China. We know that China absorbed at least 75 to 81% of the cost of those tariffs. The American consumer didn't feel it. And by the way, we tend to think of tariffs as a bilateral matter. When we impose tariffs on China, we think in binary terms, U.S. and China. But we got to remember that when we impose tariffs on China, companies move supply chains and production out of China, which to areas which are lower tariffed. So yeah, we didn't feel it in 2018. Now's a different situation. But I think that if Trump is able to do what I think he can do, which is stitch up these trade deals with other countries, we're going to see a redirection of trade, and the American consumer's just not going to feel it. But there's a more important point. For decades, American presidents have pursued deeply injurious trade policies with China, and we're going to have to pay some cost. It's just, I think that's inevitable. I don't think the cost is going to be as great as all the smart people in New York and Washington think. But even if it is, this is a cost we have to pay, because if we don't pay this cost, we become a vassal state of China. And so I just don't want to see that.
How exactly do we become a vassal state of China in the scenario you're describing?
Well, we basically have no industry left. We sell China raw materials, like we sell them soybeans and wheat, and we buy their manufactured products. And that is not a good scenario, which we're almost at that point anyway. But we just have no industry left. We have the United States completely devastated, like we see in the Rust Belt in the South, where towns and factories left, people have no hope, people are dying of fentanyl. It just becomes a wasteland. That's what we can become. And President Trump understands that. He has a heart. He sees what's happened to those communities. He's not going to leave the American worker behind like Wall Street wants us to. So, yeah, this is something we absolutely have to do. We owe this to our fellow Americans.
And so you mentioned, these injurious policies. And of course, one of those very injurious policies was the hollowing out of the working class, of the shifting of manufacturing, all of the, what's unfortunately called the creation of what's called the Rust Belt. Can you give me a broader picture of how these injurious policies played out, what they were, and what the impact was, just broadly speaking?
Well, in 2001, China acceded to the World Trade Organization after it came to a 1999 agreement with the U.S. And China took all the benefits of being a WTO member, and it did not adhere to many of its promises. And to our shame, we had a series of presidents who actually did not enforce the promises that China had made to us. So factories just did what was, the logical thing. They said, well, look, we can move to China, and so that's exactly what they did. And we allowed American business to sort of be intimidated by China. We didn't enforce our WTO rights, and that's how we got into this situation. And every American president from George W. Bush on until Biden were guilty of this, including, by the way, a guy named Donald John Trump, who was the 45th president of the United States before Biden. But Trump 47 is very different from Trump 45. Trump 45 signaled that he was going to impose tariffs. He put them on at 25%, which was inadequate. Trump saw this, and as president number 47, he said, I'm not doing that again. I'm not making the same mistakes that I made in my first term. And great for him, because he's defending the American worker like no other president has done in the WTO era. So the American people owe him a debt of gratitude. We may not like the way he's doing things. We may not like him. A lot of people in America don't. But the point is, this is an existential struggle. It is more than just a trade war, more than just a tariff war. And we better win it. And we've only got one president who can defend us right now. And like him or not, that's Donald John Trump.
Gordon, when I first saw those tariff tables, I was at the White House on Liberation Day when the announcement was made. Something struck me immediately, and it was that these countries that are the prime transshipment hubs for the Chinese Communist Party, that started after actually 2018 with the Trump 45 regime on China, basically it looked like the countries that have the highest tariffs, I mean, this is broadly speaking, there were exceptions, were these transshipment hub countries. And I found myself wondering, is this part of the play to actually stop that and make that part of the deal, to cut out all the loopholes that the Chinese Communist Party has placed in order to be able to basically avoid this type of activity from the U.S., the change of the status quo with its relationship with the U.S.?
Well, Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick has actually reportedly spoken to Vietnam and other countries in Southeast Asia and basically said, cut out this transshipment business. Part of it is, China's companies, they set up factories in Vietnam. They just don't add very much value in Vietnam, and they send it to us as a made in Vietnam product. Well, that's our fault. We know what's going on. But there's something else, and that is we know that there's completely fraudulent bills of lading where goods never go to Vietnam, but they are labeled as coming from Vietnam. And we see this on the trade documentation. We know that this is going on, and we haven't done enough about it. So this is on us, Jan. And this is something that I think that this administration, unlike previous administration, is actually going to go after the Chinese on this.
China has appointed a new top trade negotiator, seemingly unexpectedly, actually. I didn't realize that would happen by any stretch of the imagination. What do you make of that?
They want to talk, I guess. They say that they're willing to talk to us, but they really want us to call them first. And I'm just, a lot of people say, Jamie Dimon said this, why don't you just pick up the phone? Well, the reason is we've had that attitude for 5 decades, actually more than 5 decades. And look where it's gotten us. So, if the Chinese want to do something about our tariffs, it's up to them to pick up the phone. I'm just done pleading with China to do the right thing. This is just not good for us. It's not good for anybody else either. And yet we have very smart people in our country suggesting that we continue policies that obviously haven't worked for decades.
Gordon, there's also been some very prominent exemptions that were announced as well, on Apple, semiconductors, pharmaceuticals. Some people have characterized that as being actually the U.S. backing down somehow. How do you read it?
Well, what's really important is the Chinese view it as us backing down. And right after what the exemptions were announced by the Trump administration, what did China do? Did it reciprocate? No, it didn't, Jan. What it did was it started to impose the embargo on the export of rare earths to the United States. In other words, they doubled down. So this was not good implementation. But apart from what the Chinese think, and I don't think the Chinese are right, that this was the Trump administration surrendering. I don't think the Chinese are right. But apart from all of that, there should have been a better rollout of the tariffs. If the Trump administration wanted to have an exemption for electronic products and semiconductors, that should have been part of the original announcement. That makes much more sense to me, because then people can't say, oh, well, this was a climb down. So implementation, on the part of the Trump administration left a lot to be desired, but especially it left a lot to be desired because we saw the way the Chinese reacted, and that's important.
And you mentioned earlier, as you were talking about countries that are negotiating, I think you singled out Japan. You said Japan and other countries. Is there a reason you note Japan in particular?
Well, they're talking with Japan right now, and Japan's really important because it's a country where the tariffs aren't the trade barrier. The trade barrier are the non-tariff rules that inhibit trade. So we have to deal with that. And we deal with that general issue. That's important. Also, Japan's an important economy. It's the 3rd largest in the world. It's an important American ally, treaty obligation to defend Japan and Japan to defend us. I think Japan is really important in terms of the initial trade agreement. We get a good deal with Japan, then I think that the other countries will fall in line. That will be the form. That will be the template.